We'll be recording this meeting. Um, so first, some housekeeping items. Please feel free to introduce yourself, your name, and where you're joining us from in the chat. That's always helpful and nice to see where we have folks joining us from. For questions tonight, please locate those in the Q&A box, and we will get to those at the very end and try to field as many as we have time for. We can all learn from your questions, including myself, and I'm sure Jackie. So don't be shy on posting those. You will receive a follow-up email with a link to this recording, and that way you can share it around with friends and family and colleagues. We always appreciate you doing that. In addition to our habitat connectivity program here at Wild Virginia, we also have the water quality program, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. That, of course, is led by Mr. David Sly. So please be sure to tune in to some of those program events, upcoming and advocacy engagement opportunities. I also want to thank Kylie with Wild Virginia for ensuring everything runs smooth tonight in the background, keeping us straight. Please note that while Virginia can't do this important work without your help, we get our energy from you all, the energy to keep pushing for better wildlife habitat connectivity, better water quality protection. So please consider supporting us here at Wild Virginia. We appreciate your support, whether that's through donating or just helping advocate or both. Everyone can help in their own way, and we sure do appreciate it. So, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker this evening, Jackie Rosenberger from the Department of Wildlife Resources. So, Jackie is a wildlife biologist and the Elk Project Lead. Jackie's been passionate about wildlife from a young age and an avid hunter since she was about 14. She earned her biology degree from Shippensburg University in Pennsylvania, where she conducted white-tailed deer and black bear research. Jackie went on to obtain her master's degree at the University of Georgia. Go Dogs, focusing on white-tailed deer movements and hunting impacts. She has also worked on elk projects in Pennsylvania, bringing extensive experience and knowledge to her role in Virginia's elk conservation efforts. Here's some general contact information for us over at Wild Virginia. While we switch over to Jackie's screen, Jackie, take it away whenever you're ready.
Right, how does it look, guys?
It's good to me.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Trapper. I didn't even have I don't think Go Dogs was written in the script there, but you even said that, so I appreciate it. That's noted. Um, well, thank you guys for tuning into this and for your interest in the Elk program. I'm really excited to talk about the Elk program and also to touch upon the vehicle conflict mitigation part of it as well. Um, so first off, I wanted to start with the overall history of elk in Virginia and just establish the fact that elk are a native species. Um, a lot of people don't realize that, but when the colonists came to North America, like in the 1600s, 1700s, there would have been elk everywhere. In fact, at that time, it was thought that there would have been more elk than white-tailed deer. On the map at the right, the dark gray color is the native range of elk versus the current range, which is in the dark blue color. But the estimated population around that time, so like 16, 1700s, was about 10 million elk. And unfortunately, elk were unintentionally eliminated from the eastern part of the US by the late 1800s. And I underline that word unintentionally because there were species that were intentionally eliminated. One example of that would be the mountain lion. People saw them as a threat to their livestock and to themselves. But elk were unintentionally eliminated. And a lot of species that are common today, like deer and turkeys, fell victim to this as well. So basically, when the colonists were coming over here, they saw all these resources that were present on the land, and limits was not something that they had in their mind. They just saw this resource that was abundant, and they took advantage of it. And so, with through unregulated hunting and also drastic changes in the land, that's really what kind of did elk in during that time period. In Virginia, so the map at the bottom that shows the physiographic provinces of Virginia, I have that on there to demonstrate that the native range of elk would have been from the Piedmont west, so everywhere left of that red line. And the last eastern elk that was documented in Virginia was in Clark County, so up where the red star is. And 1855 is the year that the last elk was documented killed. Um, but you guys will notice, I saw in the chat before I started talking here where everyone was from, and it looks like we have a really good mix of people throughout the state. And I would bet that most of you probably have a location or some sort of geographic feature around you in Virginia that has elk in its name. And there's a lot of them. And that's really just a testament to the historic presence and the importance of elk throughout the state. So people, recognized early that they wanted to have elk back. And so in the early 1900s, there were elk restoration attempts, and a lot of other eastern states did this as well. 1913 was the first year that Virginia started getting shipments of elk from Yellowstone. And it actually started out as private individuals getting shipments of elk. The state wildlife agency in Virginia actually wasn't even formed in 1913, but they formed shortly after that. And so one of the first things that they did was jump into this game and really facilitate the movement of elk. So this occurred, throughout the period of 1913 to 1935. Unfortunately, during this time period, not a lot was known about elk in terms of what they needed habitat-wise or really how to go about this restoration attempt in a successful way. The field of wildlife management actually wasn't even officially started until 1935. So elk were kind of thrown all over the landscape in Virginia, and there was not very good natural habitat for them. To illustrate how this was not very well thought out, one of the places that elk were put was on Virginia Beach, Cape Henry. So obviously that's not even in the native range of elk. And so even the spots that elk were put that were within their native range, the natural habitat was still not very good for them. And so these elk went to agricultural areas because they needed to eat somewhere and kind of wreaked havoc for agriculture. And so, farmers had to take matters into their own hands. That is ultimately why the elk restoration was not successful in the 1900s. Elk held on in the Giles Bland County area and the Bedford and Botetourt County area the longest. In fact, they were documented occurring there throughout the 1960s. However, by 1970, there was no documentation that elk occurred in either of those places or anywhere in Virginia. So, fast forward a couple decades, and Kentucky engaged in a massive elk restoration project in their state. So, over a 5-year period from 97 to '02, they translocated over 1,500 elk from 6 different western states and put them into the eastern third of their state. This was a massive undertaking, and pretty much right away, we had elk moving across the border of Kentucky into Virginia. And there were mixed feelings on what to do about that. Some people wanted to protect them, other people did not. So two kind of seemingly contradictory things happened in the year 2000. First off, elk hunting was legalized in every county in Virginia. So that obviously was meant to discourage elk from establishing. But the second thing is our agency contracted Virginia Tech to do an elk restoration feasibility study. So basically, Virginia Tech looked at various spots in Virginia from a biological standpoint and a social standpoint to see if we can do what Kentucky was doing. There's plenty of places throughout Virginia that can sustain elk habitat wise, but and there was some support for elk during that time, but ultimately there was a lot of people that didn't support it, and Kentucky was right in the middle of their restoration. And so we really didn't know how it was going to go for them. And so it was ultimately just decided to punt and just kind of wait and see how Kentucky's program went. So the year 2009, Kentucky was having a successful time with their elk population. They weren't having the conflicts that some people thought that they might have. And so this idea was revisited, and ultimately, Buchanan County came to the state. They came to our department's board meeting and requested that they be able to have an elk population. And so ultimately, the board told the staff to come up with an elk restoration plan. And so the elk restoration zone was established as Buchanan, Dickinson, and Wise counties. Elk hunting was closed in those counties in 2011, and then from 2012 to 2014, 75 elk were trapped in Kentucky and brought to the restoration site in Buchanan County, which I have as the red star there on the map. So it's important to note that these elk that were trapped in Kentucky had to go through a quarantine period in Kentucky before they could enter Virginia. So it was a 90-day period in 2012 and 2013 and a 45-day period in 2014. And VDACS, which is the Virginia Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, and the USDA were involved in this process of testing elk for diseases, and elk had to receive a clean bill of health in order to come over into Virginia. Then once they arrived in Virginia, they were put in an acclimation pen, which is a picture there on the bottom right. And the point of this acclimation pen is what is called a soft release. Soft release is a gentle way of reintroducing an animal to an area. It promotes the animal staying in the area that you want it to be in. Um, a hard release would be, you know, you've got the animal, you're transporting the animal and you just kind of open the trailer door and you just let them run out. And so, of course, the animals are going to be freaked out. They might run for a while. You don't know where they're going to end up. But in this soft release method where you have an acclimation pen, you give the animals a week or two or so to calm down and get used to their area, and then you can slowly just kind of take the fence away and let them roam out from there. So, the Elk Restoration Zone, you might be wondering why Buchanan, Dickinson, and Wise counties? Well, obviously Buchanan because they came to the state and asked if they could have elk. But Dickinson and Wise counties were included as well because these three counties are the only counties in Virginia that are predominantly Appalachian Plateau. Historically, their economies are driven by coal mining. And they have very limited agriculture and low human density, which means you have low potential for elk-human conflicts. And you also have the ability to manage reclaimed surface coal mines as elk habitat, which we'll talk about why that's the case here in a minute. But you also have proximity to Kentucky's population because a three-county area, relatively, for an animal as large as elk, isn't a ton of space, but when you consider Kentucky's 16 county elk management zone that borders it, that really plays into the ability to have population sustainability and genetic flow. I just wanted to note here that Virginia is not unique in that we use reclaimed coal mines for elk. So in this map here, the green is the historic range of elk, the red is the current range of elk in the southeast. And as you can see, Kentucky's got a pretty large elk management zone. And all of those like are kind of huge meta population here when it comes to West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee is all centered around coal mining land. And Kentucky has the largest amount of reclaimed coal mines to offer east of the Mississippi River. And so I think they're always going to have the largest elk management zone and elk population probably because they have so much reclaimed coal mine to offer. So, what are the overall components of elk habitat? Well, there's really two main components. There's open areas, which are in the form of grasslands, early successional type areas, which elk really need for foraging. Um, and then you have forested areas. So elk wouldn't survive in a prairie type setting very well. They need to have that proximity to forested areas as well. They will find food in forested areas, but the main reason why they need forested areas is for thermal cover and also for escape cover as well. Um, Elk in Virginia actually need thermal cover more so in the summer. They do not like to be out in the middle of an open field in the summer on an afternoon when the sun is beating down. You can surely find them in the woods in the shade, just trying to relax. Water sources are also a pretty important component of elk habitat, so perhaps they're the third component. But we have a lot of ponds and wallows within our elk conservation area that the elk use. And so the reason why reclaimed mine lands create this perfect opportunity for elk habitat is because, like Buchanan County, for example, is almost completely forested. But where you have these surface coal mines, you have the potential to have fields now within the context of forest because surface coal mining essentially flattens out mountaintops and clears them, obviously. So through reclamation, you have the ability to have a field where you may not have had that ability before. I just wanted to note here that elk can be considered an umbrella species. So a lot of the work that we do on these reclaimed coal mines to improve the habitat has benefits to species beyond the elk. And this is not a comprehensive list, but these are just some examples of animals that I have seen on our elk conservation area on the areas that we manage for elk, just to give you kind of an example. You may find it strange I have a wood duck on there, but we have wood ducks that use the man-made ponds that we create for elk, which is really cool. So what do elk eat? Well, first of all, elk eat a lot. They can eat 10 to 20 plus pounds of food per day. And then cows that are pregnant or lactating consume a lot more than that. But broad categories of what they eat, you have grasses, forbs, woody browse, and also mast. And depending on the time of year, they're going to rely more heavily on certain things, more so. I always like to compare and contrast deer and elk in these presentations because a lot of people, like sometimes they'll say to me, you get to manage elk, or are they just kind of supersized deer? Which elk are in the deer family, but it's a little more complicated than that. And so there's a lot more differences between elk and deer than I have in here, but these are kind of the four main things I wanted to highlight. And the first one is actually diet, since we were just talking about food. White-tailed deer are considered concentrate selectors. They'll eat a lot of forbs and mast and woody browsing, and it depends on the time of year on how much of those they eat as a components to their diet. But deer don't eat grass very much. If all the grass on the earth ceased to exist, deer would get along fine. On the other side of the spectrum, you have grazers. So you find bison, cattle would be on the grazer side. They're eating all herbaceous plant material. Elk fall in the middle, so they are intermediate feeders. And if they lean towards one side, they actually lean more towards the grazer side. So that's the main difference between deer and elk is the grass component of an elk's diet. Of course, you can't get away from the size difference though, so that is important to mention here. Elk are about 4 to 5 times larger than deer. When you compare the average size bull in Virginia versus the average size buck, you can see the difference in body weights there, shoulder height, and even max antler weight. So significant size difference. Also, social structure. And rut, especially during the rut, is significantly different between elk and deer. So elk are true herd animals. Deer are social animals, and you usually see them with other deer, but they don't form herds. And so the biggest herds that elk will form is during the winter. We're regularly seeing groups of 40, 50 elk this time of year, but it's possible that you can see 70 plus in a group. And that is not abnormal. That is just what elk do. Deer, on the other hand, if you've got a group of 50 deer all together in a field, I can guarantee you have an overpopulation issue of deer. Um, and during the rut, which is the breeding season, elk bulls will form a harem, which is a group of cows and calves that they will try to establish dominance over. And they will try to defend that group of cows and calves in the entirety of the breeding season, which is September and October. And this is a very dynamic process. Bulls are constantly challenging one another, trying to take over. Um, but this is very different from deer, where bucks are just kind of nomadic. They kind of, they roam around on their own, solitary. They're looking for does. They'll only stay with a doe for a day or so, and then he'll move on and try to find more does. And then lastly, elk have half the reproductive potential that deer do. Does that are 2.5 or older and healthy should be having twins every year, whereas elk cows only have one calf a year. There's a less than 1% chance that they would ever have more than one. Okay. On this slide here, I just wanted to make the point. So these pictures here are the four living subspecies of the North American elk. There are two extinct subspecies, but I bring this up because I doubt any of you can tell the difference in all of these pictures and tell me which is which. which is the point. A lot of people think that the elk that we have on the landscape now are not the same elk that once were here, and that is not the case. They are the same species. North American elk, Cervus canadensis is the scientific name. And the definition of a species are animals that can interbreed and produce viable, fertile offspring. And the elk that would have been here originally could have done that with the elk that are here now because they're the same species. Um, there are 40 different subspecies of white-tailed deer that no one really talks about, but white-tailed deer were moved all over the eastern United States, actually more so than elk. Virginia has received deer from 11 different states, and it's for the same reason. Deer were hunted down during the period, before wildlife agencies were created and before we had hunting regulations, and so they had to be restored as well. And so, the deer that are on our landscape in Virginia, or the elk that are on the landscape in Virginia, are no less native than the deer that are here. Okay. Elk management plan, just want to go over this briefly. All of our major game species we have in Virginia, our management follows a management plan. So basically, the point of that is to have goals and objectives for that species in the Commonwealth. And this is very much a public engagement process. It's not our agency making these decisions. We have a stakeholder advisory committee. We had 17 members on that for this elk management plan, and they represent a lot of different interests, and they get to learn about elk, give their opinions and their values, and ultimately get to vote on a list of goals and objectives for elk in the Commonwealth. We also utilize public surveys, and we put out this draft plan for public comment. And I can personally guarantee everyone here that if you comment on a draft management plan, our agency reads every single comment and we take it into consideration. This plan was endorsed in 2019, and the most significant thing that came out of it is that Buchanan, Dickinson, and Wise counties would remain the counties that we would promote elk in. It was decided to not promote elk in any other county besides those three, and we also transitioned from calling them the Elk Restoration Zone to the Elk Management Zone. So we were moving from a restoration phase in our elk program to a management phase. Throughout the tenure of this plan, we will not be moving elk anywhere throughout the state. It also provides guidance for elk-related recreation, viewing, and hunting. There's also something specific in the plan about minimizing and mitigating elk-human conflicts, including elk vehicle collisions. So that's something the public wanted us to focus on. Our current population status for elk in Southwest Virginia is 250 plus. We're confident that we have 250 animals in Buchanan County, but we also have elk in other counties. Wise County, we have a significant number of elk that have naturally moved over from Kentucky and have established themselves in Virginia, and elk also occur in other parts of Southwest Virginia as well. Elk viewing is a really important part of our elk program. We have scheduled public tours that people can sign up to come and view elk in Buchanan County. Our agency offers those tours, and Breaks Interstate Park offers them. Breaks is actually doing spring tours. I think they have openings for them right now, so if you guys are interested, you could check that out. But they do tours in the fall as well, and so do we. Um, there's an estimated over 1,300 people that will come annually for these scheduled tours, and that's actually limited by capacity. We the demand exceeds the supply on that right now, but we're able to accommodate over 1,300 people a year from a lot of different states and even multiple foreign countries we've had people come from. We also have public land now in Buchanan County. We have public viewing shelters on county-owned property that people can come anytime and try to view elk and other wildlife. And we also have public land now through an agreement with a very large landowner in Buchanan County where people can come to hike or ATV or even hunt other species and be able to see elk. We have our elk webcam that is live from generally from September to December. We had our 8th season for that this past year, and that's a really cool opportunity for folks to view our elk no matter where they are, from their phones or their tablets or their computers. And then lastly here, the elk hunt. So this fall was our 4th elk hunt already. And so each of these 4 years, we've had 6 lucky hunters that could come and hunt for a bull elk. The hunt has occurred completely in Buchanan County so far. That's where we've got private lands that have opened up access for hunters. And most important thing to note here about the hunt is that it's not about population control. That's why we only allow bulls, and it's very limited. Really, it's all about providing recreational opportunities for hunters without having a negative impact on population growth. So as soon as we reach that point in our population, we wanted to offer those opportunities for hunters, and it was one of the goals of having the elk population in the first place was to have a huntable population. So the hunt is an amazing thing. Um, it's honestly the most fun event throughout the year for our elk program. We come together with landowners and volunteers, and it's a great time. This picture here with this hunter, this is a hunter from this past year. Uh, he came alone. He didn't bring anyone with him, just himself. But all the people in that photo are just local people that came to help him get that elk out of the woods. And you can see the smiles on their faces. It's almost like they killed the elk themselves. But we have a lot more people than that volunteer with the elk hunt. But it just kind of shows how much of a team effort it is. Okay. So I just wanted to hit home the point here that, the elk program, it's not just about the animals themselves. Yes, the elk program is about restoring a native species. It's even, has helped to restore coal mining lands and improve habitat and populations of other wildlife species. However, the elk program has been, and really what the goal of it in the first place was to be a good thing for people and a good thing for the local people of Buchanan County. It really has helped them with their economy. Coal mining isn't what it isn't what it has been, and it probably won't be in the future. And so Buchanan County needs to turn to other things to help diversify their economy. And this ecotourism thing is one thing they're really trying to lean into. And so it really has helped bring people to Buchanan County and make it a destination, give people a reason to be there. And beyond the local people, also the impact of visitors is a major thing as well. All the hunters that come to hunt elk and all the people that come to view elk um, is an amazing experience for them. We've had people get very emotional on these elk tours. We've had people cry. We've had people hug us, even though we don't know them from Adam, just for giving them this experience. And so we love that. We manage the animals. We love the animals, but we're really doing it for the people, which I absolutely love about my job. Okay, so that's kind of the background about the elk program, and then I wanted to address the elk and roadways, since that's something that, Wild Virginia really focuses on. So, first, just like I did with the elk, I wanted to start off with a background kind of about roads in this area. So, a new highway project began construction in 2009 in Buchanan County. It's called Corridor Q. It is meant to connect Elkhorn City, Kentucky, which is right here, to Grundy, Virginia. Um, if you guys remember from earlier in the presentation, 2009 is also the year that Buchanan County came to the state and asked if they could have an elk population. Corridor Q is part of the Appalachian Development Highway System, which was created in 1965 by Congress to connect Appalachia to the interstate system and encourage economic and tourism development in previously isolated areas. Um, I can personally attest to this highway has been very nice. There's a significant reduction in travel times. For those of you that are familiar with this area, you can make it from Breaks Interstate Park to Southern Gap Outdoor Adventures in like 15, 20 minutes now instead of an hour. So it's been a very positive thing for the local area. Um, the interesting dynamic here is that the construction of this highway has also led to the geographic expansion of elk in Buchanan County. So I'll go back to this map here. Elk were restored, so in a straight line distance from the closest point on the highway to where we restored elk. Where we restored elk would be kind of down here where my mouse is waving. So about 4 to 5 miles in a straight line to the point on the corridor there is where we restored elk. So you can see Kentucky's here, they have elk, and then we put elk here. So corridor Q is basically in the middle. Um, so it's been very interesting to watch. the collar data that we have for elk that have GPS collars, they have literally followed the construction process. And so, just like people, elk are using this highway as an easy means of travel. The terrain in Buchanan County, it's crazy steep. Um, and so not only are there foraging opportunities, which you can tell from some of the photos on there for elk, but they're ultimately traveling along this road between Kentucky and Virginia. Um, and to illustrate this point, a couple years ago when we looked at home range sizes between our elk, the elk that did not use the corridor area had home ranges of like 2 to 4 square miles, um, about 4 square miles. And then the elk that did use the corridor had 20 plus square miles in their home range. So it just goes to show how they're covering long distances with a short amount or a small amount of effort. So, a 9 mile stretch of Corridor Q opened in November of 2023. So that was open to traffic. And then another 3 mile stretch opened in October of 2025. And the remaining 2 miles, which is the part that will connect the town of Grundy, will open in 2027. So it's a 14-mile highway project. And so far, we've got 12 miles of it open. So prior to November 2023, there was only a few elk vehicle collisions that were documented since elk were restored. Um, it was way less than 1% of the elk population in terms of vehicle collisions per elk population. And it was not a concern. It wasn't a concern for the elk population. It was not a concern for the local people because it was so rare and few and far between. But since November 2023, we've had 40 elk vehicle collisions that have been reported. 37 of those were confirmed on site. And I just I take the 40 as a minimum number. You know, there's plenty of research that demonstrates that not all wildlife vehicle collisions are reported. And to add to that, a good chunk of those were ones that people like bystanders or people that were just driving by and either saw a dead or injured elk on the side of the road would call it in, but it was not the driver that hit the elk that called it in. So, um, but nonetheless, 40 reported collisions is what we know about. So this kind of just shows on a map here. So this gray line here is the 9 mile section of a corridor that's been open since November 2023. This red solid line is the part that's been open since this past October. It's that 3 mile section. And then it continues on here with the part that isn't open yet. And then we have Southern Gap Road here, which is um, which is the white line. This road previously was a dead end road, but now it's a major place where people get on and off the corridor, especially since the corridor is not open to Grundy yet. So unfortunately, we've had a few collisions on that road now that traffic was open to Corridor Q. I'm not going to go through all of this, but this is just kind of the breakdown of our data. I think the main thing from this is that we've had more collisions in the winter than any other season. It seems like our elk are spending more time along the roads in the winter, and people are spending more times on the road where day length is shorter. So I think people are driving in the dark more in the corridor during the winter as well, which does not help with visibility. The overwhelming majority of these collisions have occurred at night. In fact, there's only one or two that I can think of off the top of my head that occurred in the daylight. So, as a percentage of our population right now, in terms of the reported elk vehicle collisions, kind of divided by our population size, 5% of our population in the year 2024 was we had accounted for in elk vehicle collisions, and then it was 9% of the population in 2025, unfortunately. And prior to November 2023, it was less than 1%. Okay, so obviously threefold issue here, which I can relate back to the previous slide I had about, the value of elk. Obviously, from a conservation standpoint, this isn't good. I mean, we have a limited elk population and we're trying to grow it. And now vehicle collisions are a leading source of mortality for our elk. Um, Also, for local economy, obviously anything that threatens the sustainability of the elk herd threatens the local economy that depends a lot on it for people to come and view the elk and hunt as well. And also, I think that eventually both elk and corridor Q may develop a negative perception if this issue continues to persist. And then, of course, thinking about the people affected. I mean, obviously, extensive vehicle damage and emotional trauma for people that run into an elk. By the grace of God, no one has gotten injured significantly that I have heard about in any of these collisions, which is absolutely amazing. But still, a lot of impacts to people going through this event. The good news, though, on a positive note, both Elk and Corridor Q are good for Buchanan County's economy. In fact, they both have the same goal, which is to bring people to Buchanan County. So not only can these two things coexist, but they can actually complement one another if we can put forth effort in mitigation. So I'm gonna try to, I don't know how I'm doing on time. I'll try not to go through this stuff in super detail, but I just wanted to give you guys an overview of kind of what has been done thus far to address the issue. Prior to the corridor being open, a lot of us could see the writing on the wall here in terms of an issue, and we wanted to try to be proactive about it. And so we worked with VDOT on a crossing structure study. So the study purpose was to determine potential design, placement, costs, and funding opportunities for wildlife crossing structures on Corridor Q. It was published in October 2023, and it's publicly available. And I'll try to hit the highlights here. It was a pretty extensive study. So we essentially took the corridor, we broke it up into half-mile segments, and had a buffer area around each segment, and we evaluated each segment for a variety of factors. We looked at elk movement, we looked at habitat, we looked at terrain features, topography. Engineers from the Bristol office of VDOT even came out and told us where cost-effective structures could be placed. So we had that engineering input. Ultimately, from that whole analysis, we came up with 10 locations, 10 ideal locations where we could put wildlife crossings, kind of like a plan for the whole corridor. So we had two overpass locations, eight underpass locations, and our average distance between structures that we had in here was about 1.2 miles. The engineers even drew sketches of what these crossing structures will look like. There's a 3D model here, which is really cool, what an overpass might look like on Corridor Q. We did a cost versus benefit analysis, and I would say a lot of credit to Bridget Donaldson from VTRC. She did the overwhelming majority of this work and was amazing to work with. But one of the things she did was a cost benefit analysis looking at the average cost of a structure versus the average cost of a deer and elk crash and seeing how many crashes would a structure have to avoid per year to basically start paying for itself. So that's what this graph shows. And she found that 2.8 elk crashes or 5.4 deer crashes would have to be avoided per structure per year. And honestly, with the number of elk crashes we've had alone, it seems as though that would be the case if we had wildlife crossing structures. We had a funding expert on our team, Renee Callahan from ARC Solutions. She did an extensive analysis of all the federal funding programs that were available and described how our project would be, what standing they would have to get that funding. And she ultimately ranked those in terms of, what funding program would be the best for us to go for. The nice thing is that being in an economically disadvantaged area and associated with Appalachian Development Highway System, we could qualify for 100% federal funding for some of these funding programs, which is awesome. And then while Virginia was very gracious on their Virginia Safe Wildlife Corridors Collaborative page, created a page just for our study where we could describe what we were doing. We had 22 study supporters and also multiple nonprofits offered us. We had multiple funding offers from nonprofits, which was very nice. So, okay, so that was the crossing structure study. Also, there's an animal detection system feasibility study that VDOT spearheaded, which I will talk about here in a second. Well, yes. So on this slide, so from the feasibility study, VDOT decided to actually do a pilot study for the animal detection systems, which is actually in progress right now. There's an animal detection system set up on a half-mile segment on the corridor. And so really the point of the study is to look at or to test detection accuracy and reliability, driver response, effectiveness over each season, or weather conditions, maintenance requirements, operational considerations, and ultimately determine if this system could be used as an elk crash countermeasure on corridor Q. And so, for those of you who don't know, essentially an animal detection system, we have a half-mile segment where there's thermal cameras and radar, and if it detects an animal on the roadway within that half-mile segment, it sends a message to a message board that is a quarter mile on either end of that half-mile segment. So the whole thing is a mile. You can picture that. And that message board would then warn drivers, hey, animal detected ahead, slow down, something like that. So that's something that's underway. The only, well, say the only, but one challenge to this is that it's just over a defined part of the roadway, so just a half mile. And as you guys saw on the map, these crashes are happening all over the corridor that's open to traffic right now. And so there really isn't an exact hot spot that we have a problem with. It's really the whole road. So it would be difficult to have this system be a whole corridor wide solution. Static signs, VDOT's worked with us to put static signs up. So, your standard elk crossing signs, like you have deer crossing signs. Two of those signs have flashing lights on them right now, and we're hopefully working to get more flashers up here soon. There have been temporary message boards at certain points. We haven't had any in a while, but just as VDOT has message boards available, we've been able to put messages up there to try to warn people to slow down, that elk are present on the road. And then the first version of the Wildlife Corridor Action Plan, elk were mentioned as kind of a case study. Um, and as you can see, the area down here, Buchanan County, where the corridor Q is, was a main resilience priority area. And so the DCR, their data tool here, the natural habitat and ecosystem diversity and the protected landscapes resilience is found along this area here where corridor Q is. And then lastly, kind of the most recent update of what's going on is the second version or the update to the WCAP is being worked on right now. And there's an elk specific work group that has been formed as a part of this process. And so that's actually been really nice. We've been having regular meetings for the past month or two, and we've been discussing both short-term and long-term solutions to this issue. So it's been nice to have, dialogue and regular meetings on it. So um, I think that this is the last slide I have. So I just want to end on kind of a positive note. Like I said, this is a solvable issue. I think both the road and the elk can coexist and they can complement one another. It's going to take a lot of work, but I think that as long as we keep these discussions up and keep putting in the work, I think that, elk and this road can exist together. And that is it. I'm happy to take as many questions as I have time for, and I'm sorry if I went over a little long there, Trapper.
That's perfect. And thank you so much, Jackie. Super informative. Um, we do have a couple questions in the chat that I can share. Give me 1 second here. All right. How do elk stay confined to these counties? Is hunting allowed year-round outside of those counties to help control population, for example? Are they confined to those counties in Virginia?
That's a great question. Yes, hunting outside of Buchanan, Dickinson, and Wise counties for elk is legal during deer season if you have a deer tag. So if you are hunting in Russell County and you've got a deer tag and you see an elk, you can kill that elk with your deer tag. And so that is meant to discourage elk from establishing outside of the elk management zone. Um, so we may get one, maybe two. The since I've been here, the most elk that we've had killed outside the zone that have been reported to us, I believe, was four in 1 year. And Lee County is probably since I've been here, Lee County has been the leading county for elk harvest, and that is the only other county that borders Kentucky and Virginia that's not in our elk management zone. And so those elk can, come over from Kentucky. But in terms of like how do they stay in the management zone, they just mostly stay naturally because I mean they have everything that they need. within the elk management zone, so they really don't have a reason to go on an adventure where conditions would be uncertain, since their needs are being met where they're at right now. So, really, the whole point about wildlife management and what my job is to make sure that our population stays in check and that we have habitat and lands for them. So that's really the two main ways to manage a population or to keep it where you want it is to make sure the numbers are appropriate and that you have the lands available for those elk. And right now, we have plenty of lands available for them within the elk management zone and enough room for them to expand within the elk management zone.
Great. Um, for someone that harvests an elk, what kind of money goes back into the local economy, the local community?
That's a good question. I mean, all the hunters that come, obviously, they have to pay for lodging. I'm sure they're paying for some sort of food as well. It just depends. Now, I will say that, we only have 6 hunters a year. So their contribution to the local economy would be a lot more limited compared to the people that actually come to view elks. We have a lot more supply, I guess you think about it as for people that come to view elk. So I would say that's where your major input into the local economy would be right now for people coming and staying, eating, at local restaurants, even paying for the tour themselves. Or if people that, if they stay at Breaks Interstate Park, they do other activities there at the park as well. So I would say, we're always going to be limited on hunting elk, because we're never going to have a population where we can just let anyone kill an elk. But in theory, the people that can come view elk, even since we have public lands now, I mean, anyone is free to come on those public lands to view elk. So I think that's really where the economic benefit is.
About deer disease, how easily are those transmitted over to elk?
Yeah, pretty much all the diseases that deer can get, elk can get as well. So they're both in the cervid family. You may hear that term, which is the deer family. There's 5 species in the deer family in North America. So like CWD, for example, it might be what you have in mind there. Elk are susceptible to that, although interestingly, they are less susceptible than deer. So looking at other states that have both deer and elk populations, it's very interesting. Like within the same geographic area where you have CWD, prevalence rates are generally higher for white-tailed deer than they are for elk. So it's not understood why very well. There are some physiological differences and some things that have been proposed as explanations for that. But elk, just like the contagiousness of CWD within elk is not that of the levels of deer, interestingly. Um, the other two diseases, so when we have a dead elk for whatever reason, and that we can get our hands on, we routinely test for CWD, bovine tuberculosis, and brucellosis. Bovine tuberculosis and brucellosis are two diseases that are of interest to the agriculture industry. And so we make sure that we keep testing our animals to make sure that we don't have an issue with that. And so I hate to say statements like this out loud, but we have not detected any of those three diseases in our elk population.
Thank you, Jackie. Let's see what else here. Can you talk a little bit about, I think you already answered this one, but the hunters, they're chosen to harvest an elk through the lottery system, correct?
Correct. Yeah. So with the 6 hunters that we have, 5 are through our DWR lottery, and one of those is guaranteed to be from the elk management zone. So it needs to be a resident from Buchanan, Dickinson, or Wise counties. And then no more than one of those 5 can be an out-of-state resident. And we get a lot of confusion on this. Some people think that we guarantee an out-of-state resident, which we do not. We just say if we draw one by chance, then that's going to be it. We're not going to draw anymore. The sixth one, we allow a conservation organization to raffle off. And so in the past, we've had Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation do that a couple times, and then last year was Southwest Virginia Sportsman. And so all of that money from that sixth one that gets specifically raffled, that money goes back to elk. To It's been habitat projects that have been used or that have been spent with that money. So that's been really nice to have that money go directly back into elk. And that winner can be from anywhere. That could be a resident or non-resident.
Do the elk go after the road salt in winter on the roads?
I have physically witnessed them licking the roads, yes, in the winter. So perhaps, that can be another potential reason why winter we seem to have more elk vehicle collisions as well. Yeah.
Um, let's see. So there's a question, what is Virginia doing to build wildlife crossings into the development of new highways so that they don't have to be retrofitted?
That's a great question. I'm not gonna I don't have the details on that. Those are probably more higher level conversations between people in my department and VDOT, but obviously I think that's would be something very very beneficial to have in place. I mean, like states out west, that's standard for them. When they're doing new highway projects, they evaluate what, might be needed for wildlife crossings. And yeah, so they don't need to retrofit. So it would be really nice to get to a point in Virginia where we do that.
I can kind of add to that too, Jackie, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Just
Yeah.
saying that, yeah, that's certainly something a lot of the nonprofit organizations like Wild Virginia and our partners are working towards is trying to get that to be the norm, not just a consideration, but to be a normal part of the road planning process. We are seeing some other states do that, like Jackie just mentioned. And I will say, like, just putting in a shameless plug here that tomorrow morning there's a really important bill at the State House, and this would is House Bill 597 that would create the Wildlife Corridor Grant Fund, and it will in fact set up a fund and a funding mechanism based on voluntary donations to help pay for some of these projects. Jackie talked about the Wildlife Corridor Action Plan and how it prioritizes these areas of importance where we may need some crossings or some crossing infrastructure like a upsized culvert. And the Wildlife Corridor Grant Fund, should this bill pass in the Senate, it's already made it through the House. Should it pass through the subcommittee and the committee tomorrow morning and then make it to the full Senate body, this would actually help fund some of those and or at least be a start. So, if you're able to advocate for things like that and legislation, it's a really good opportunity. I'll be there tomorrow morning, but I just wanted to mention that. So, tune in to House Bill 597. That'll help get some of this infrastructure on the ground and reduce some of these collisions. Um, Other than size, what's the difference between an elk and a moose?
Well, that's a good question. Yeah, so moose are the largest member of the deer family. Um, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on moose, but from my understanding, moose are more of a like a woodland type species, less like elk. Elk to me, they're a lot like cattle. Like you see them out in the fields, kind of grazing, and from what I understand about moose, they're more of like they're a woodland type species. Um, they're probably going to be eating things more closely to what deer eat than what elk eat. Elk or moose are also the most aggressive animal in North America. They're I have a lot of respect for biologists that work with moose. Like for example, like calf studies with moose can be pretty dangerous. If a female moose sees you around her calf. I mean, with any animal that can be an issue, but moose are especially aggressive. So
Are the elk hunts guided? Are the lottery hunts guided?
it's a great question. Most of them are. It's an amazing thing. We have a group of local guys that are a lot of them are landowners, some of them are not. They're just volunteers, but they're just an amazing group of guys and they offer guiding to these hunters for free. Because these guys Buchanan County's so passionate about their elk program. They just want to see it successful and they want to help people that come in here. I mean, the hunters are really embraced with open arms when they come here and they get a lot of help. The hunters don't have to be guided, but most of them choose to get that help.
Are there any programs that encourage volunteers to assist in maintaining the elk habitat?
Well, for starters, if you're interested, we have a volunteer work weekend every year that's actually coming up here the end of March. It is March 28th, which is the last Saturday of March. And so we'll get together at Southern Gap Outdoor Adventures in the morning and have a a little meeting and people kind of disseminate out from there and do different habitat type projects and then we usually reconvene. We have lunch and dinner together and we usually let people shed hunt if they want to look for elk sheds in the afternoon after we're done with the work. So anyone is welcome to attend that. You don't have to sign up or anything. You can just show up that morning. If you follow Southwest Virginia Sportsmen on Facebook, they should be posting about it. But if for some reason, if you can't find any info about it, feel free to reach out to me directly.
I've got a question, Jackie, just since we're talking about maintaining this, this open, earlier successional type habitat for the elk, in addition to the forest for cover. Um, how much of a role do you think something like a low intensity fire would have been historically to maintaining some of these open areas for elk?
Very, very significant. Yeah, I mean, if you guys think about it, like, bison used to be in the eastern part of the United States. And so obviously, bison are grazers, as I mentioned. And so, yeah, the bison they wouldn't be able to survive in the eastern United States now. There's not enough grassland. And so, yeah, I mean, a lot of fires, both like natural fires, just like lightning, induced fires, but also, people overlook the fact that Native Americans, they were smart. Like they found out really early that, a year or two after an area would burn, it would be really good hunting. They'd find a lot of deer and a lot of wildlife in it. So Native Americans actually intentionally set fires as well, on like kind of a rotational basis, which was really cool. So yeah, I think fire probably played a huge role. In maintaining open areas in the eastern United States back in the day.
Great. Maybe just one more to respect your time. Got a question here. Will Breaks acquisition of SGOA affect the hunt check-in process?
No, it will not. Breaks. What he's talking about there is Southern Gap Outdoor Adventures was purchased by Breaks Interstate Park a couple months ago, and there's no better entity. If the owners that owned Southern Gap previously, if they can't own it, there's no better entity than Breaks Interstate Park. So yeah, everything's going to go on as it normally is going to go on. Breaks is such a great partner for us, and I'm really excited to work with them more now that they own Southern Gap.
Great. Well, I think we should stop there. We're almost at 7:30. Jackie, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for all the information and thanks to everyone online and for joining us tonight. Great conversation. Join us again. Be on the lookout for an email with the recording and some follow-up materials. Appreciate it. Nice job,
Thank you
Jackie.
all.
Appreciate it. All right. Y'all have a good evening.
All right, you guys too. Thanks.
Bye.